Episode 37, 22nd of September, 1914. Suicide Squadron. Tragedy of the Broad 14s. One U-boat sinks 3 cruisers. By Commander Tyrer, RD, RNR. Read by David Ridges. A severe blow to the British Navy occurred on September the 22nd, 1914, when 3 cruisers, the Hogue, Aboukir and Cressy, were sunk in the North Sea by the torpedoes of one German submarine. The narrative which follows is one that was originally told by Commander Tyrer, one of the Hogue survivors, to Captain Barry O'Brien. His pitiful story of a sea black with drowning men is related with a power and directness worthy of the greatest naval writers. The naval reserves were called out on August 3, 1914, and on that momentous day I was ordered down to Chatham Barracks, from where I was sent aboard the Hogue, which vessel was lying off the dockyard. All regular naval officers and men had been recalled from leave on July the 27th, and there was great activity. Vessels were being coaled at breakneck speed. Empty lorries, and lorries laden with stores and ammunition, thundered up and down the hot, dusty road leading from and to the dockyard gates. Working parties of bluejackets hastened with handcarts in and out of the stores depot. On the parade ground, fresh detachments of sailors and marines were constantly being lined up, inspected and marched off. Everyone in Chatham seemed suddenly to have jumped into uniform. Brass-hatted admirals, commodores and captains strode hither and thither with official documents under their arms and a grim look in their eyes. Though it had not yet been declared, war with Germany was regarded as inevitable, and everyone, officers and men alike, were in a fair flutter of excitement for fear the fun would be over without their having been in it. The Hogue was manned by a nucleus crew when I joined her. However, within 36 hours her complement had been made up to full strength, and before daylight spread over Chatham on August the 5th, only a few hours after declaration of war, we were at sea, in company with the Aboukir and Cressy, bound down channel. After spending a few days cruising to and fro between the Collingsbeg lightship and Galley Head, the 3 of us proceeded to the eastern entrance of the English Channel. Here, with Sheerness as our base, we were joined by the Euryalus and the Bacchante. The 5 of us, with the Euryalus as flagship, comprised the 7th Cruiser Squadron of the 3rd Fleet. Our job, according to our war orders, was to support the 1st and 3rd flotillas of light cruisers and destroyers operating from Harwich, and to look out for enemy transports and any blacklist neutral vessels that might have slipped through the outer patrols. Of 12,000 tons displacement, these 5 armoured cruisers of the Bacchante class were all about 15 years old. Their armament consisted of 12 6-inch and 2 9.2-inch guns. They had a maximum speed of 21.5 knots, and each carried a crew of approximately 750 officers and men. Captain Wilmot S. Nicholson was our captain in the Hogue. Commander Reginald S. Norton was the chief executive officer. In addition to other RN officers, we carried 3 RNR officers, including myself, and a number of young cadets fresh from Osborne. Shortly after we had taken up our beat in the narrow seas, the vessels of our squadron were detailed to assist the transportation and cover the disembarkation of the Brigade of Marines, which, on August the 27th, was landed at Ostend to endeavour to relieve the pressure on our troops retreating from Mons and to give the Germans the impression that a much more formidable force was to follow. The landing was effected without mishap. 2 days later, on August the 28th, the Heligoland Bight action took place, and my vessel was given the job of towing the Arethusa, which had been disabled in the action, back to harbour. From that date until the tragic disaster 3 weeks later, life ran smoothly enough for us. Sometimes we patrolled the Dogger Bank area, at other times the Broad 14s over on the Dutch coast. The 5 of us took it in turns to return to Sheerness to coal and give the men a run ashore. Thus there were never more than 4 and sometimes only 3 of us on patrol at a time. Weather permitting, we always had a destroyer escort, from which fact we judged that we were regarded as of some importance. We'd been told that our job was to support the first and third flotillas of light cruisers and destroyers, but hitherto they had conducted their activities without calling on us. Could there be another reason for our presence in the narrow seas, we wondered? And then, at last, someone suggested one. We were a suicide squadron, he averred. Our real function was to act as decoys. We were to entice the German fleet into attacking us, then lead it away from its base southwards, while our Grand Fleet and battlecruiser squadron swept down from the northward, cut off its retreat, cornered it, and finally annihilated it over our dead bodies. Within a week of first having been whispered, this explanation of our real function had become an accepted fact, not merely with the men in the squadron itself, but with the whole of Sheerness, and even the main fleets up north. The summer of 1914 broke about the middle of September. A series of equinoctial gales followed. The first of these lasted from September the 18th to the 21st. On the 19th, the weather was so bad that the destroyer flotillas were ordered back to harbour. In a message to the Admiralty, the Admiral of our squadron suggested that he should continue the patrol of the Dogger Bank area with the cruisers alone. The Admiral's reply, broadcast to all concerned, was as follows. The Dogger Bank patrol need not be continued. Weather too bad for destroyers to go to sea. Arrange for cruisers to watch the Broad 14s. This message subsequently came in for much criticism, and several brass hats lost their jobs at the Admiralty as a result of it. It was argued by many officers that the Dogger Bank area was the area that should have been patrolled in the circumstances. The sea there was much worse than on the Broad 14s, they pointed out, and the risk of submarine attack consequently far less. These craft in 1914 were not the big, highly efficient boats they were in 1917 and 1918. They needed far more favourable conditions under which to attack. The Broad 14's patrol, which we now took up, extended in a north-northeast and south-southwest line of direction, between the Terschelling lightship to the northward and the Mars lightship to the southward, a distance of 92 miles. The patrol at this time consisted of 4 ships, Euryalus, Cressy, Hogue and Aboukir. The Bacchante was at Sheerness, and on September the 20th, the flagship followed her there to Cole. Her need of fuel at this juncture proved very fortunate for her. During the afternoon of the 21st, the weather began to moderate, and that night our destroyer escort started out from Harwich to join us. Criticism has been levelled at the senior officer of the squadron at that time for not going to meet them. His reasons for not doing so are best known to himself. Reaching the northern limit of the patrol, viz. The Terschelling lightship, around 9 p.m, the 3 of us turned and steamed slowly southward. We were in line ahead formation, about 2 miles from one another in the following order: Aboukir, Hogue, Cressy. None of us was zigzagging. I was acting as navigator on the Hogue during the middle watch that night. The navigator relieved me at 4 a.m. A few minutes later, having reached the southern limit of the beat, west of the Mars lightship, the 3 of us turned 16 points in rotation and headed up north again. As soon as this manoeuvre had been completed, I went below and turned in. Within 10 minutes I was fast asleep. 2 hours later, at 6:25 a.m. to be exact, I was awakened by the bugler sounding general quarters. A general stampeding of feet followed, above which my ear detected a quicker and louder throb from the engines below. 6 weeks of living on top of a volcano, so to speak, expecting to be blown sky high at any moment, had got us into the habit of dressing quickly. Within 3 minutes I was on deck, fully clothed. Dawn had broken. The Aboukir was on our beam, and the Cressy was closing from astern. Someone told me that the Aboukir had hit, or been hit, by something. He thought it was a mine. Her speed had dropped to about 4 knots, and we went quickly past her. A few minutes later, however, we reduced our speed to conform with hers. We were then about a quarter of a mile ahead of her. Meanwhile, the Cressy had closed and taken up station about 400 yards on her port beam. I do not know what the senior captain's intention was at that moment. If, under the impression that the Aboukir had hit a mine, he no doubt hoped that she would be able to reach port under her own steam, and intended her 2 consorts to accompany her. Any such hope must have quickly been dispelled from his mind, however, for the lame vessel slowly lost way and, rolling sluggishly athwart the swell, began to heel over to port and settle by the head. Aboard the Hogue, the engines were instantly put to full astern, and orders were given to turn out all boats and unlash and throw overboard all timber on the upper deck. My job was to lower the port cutter. While I was doing that, the Aboukir heeled over still more. Her crew were frantically trying to launch their boats. One of these, laden with men, began to move slowly down the starboard or high side of the vessel, but so steep had become her list that it stuck halfway. Using boat hooks and oars, the sailors tried to thrust it off without avail. Finally abandoning the attempt, they tore off their clothes and crawled out of the boat onto the ship's side, now lying over at an angle of about 60 degrees. Scores of other naked men had meanwhile begun to claw their way down it. The rising sun glistened on their bodies and on the wet, smooth steel plates of the vessel's rounded bilge. Down they came, slowly, inch by inch, some sitting, others standing, several lying flat. And then, suddenly, it was all over. The vessel had completely turned turtle, and on all sides of her, as she floated for a few minutes bottom up, the sea was literally black with a mass of struggling humanity. Our two cutters had by now been dispatched to rescue, and the big picket boat was being hoisted without steam up on the main derrick, when suddenly there was a muffled explosion under me, and I realised that a torpedo, and not a mine, had sunk the Aboukir, and that we had been torpedoed as well. A second torpedo struck us almost immediately after the first, apparently under the 9.2 magazine aft. For this time there was a tremendous explosion, and a shower of debris and sparks rose with a dense, black volume of smoke from the bowels of the ship and shot into the sky. The concussion of this second explosion sent men sprawling in all directions. A series of violent tremors ran through the vessel, and she began slowly to heel over to starboard. Whatever may have been their doubts about the Aboukir sinking, our men quite clearly had none with regard to the Hogue's fate. Confusion suddenly broke loose. Men rushed here and there. Some tore at the lashings of a Pattern 3 target, a large contraption capable of supporting several men. Others rushed below and returned with mess stools, benches, and rolled-up hammocks which they flung overboard. Most of the heavy timber on deck had already gone over, but the chocks of the boats remained. These were torn up and pitched over after the other things. Within 3 minutes of the first torpedo hitting her, the Hogue's list had increased to about 40 degrees, and realising that her end was very near, all hands began to tear off their clothes and crawl down the high side or jump overboard to leeward. To add to the general confusion, the stokehold crowd suddenly poured on deck, their blackened faces dripping sweat and tense with apprehension. It was now a case of every man for himself, and tearing off my boots and clothing, and then fastening to my wrist by its chain my gold watch, which I greatly prized, I walked down the sloping deck into the water and struck out for dear life. My immediate intention was to get clear of the sinking ship before she toppled over on top of me. In this I was not successful, however. Glancing upward, I saw the 4 leaning funnels towering above me. The next instant, with a seething hiss and a tremendous splash, they literally came down on top of me, carrying me beneath the surface. How I escaped being crushed to death, I shall never know. After what seemed an interminable time, I became aware of the alarming fact that I was jammed between the steam pipe on one of the funnels and the funnel itself. I tried desperately to kick myself clear, but could not move. The heat from the steam pipe was scorching my bare flesh, and my chest felt as if it were going to burst. Then gradually, a feeling of extreme drowsiness overcame me. I no longer felt any suffocation or any fear. On the contrary, I recollect feeling pleasantly surprised that drowning was not as bad as I had imagined it. No doubt, I was actually drowning at that moment. Indeed, to have experienced that strange, apathetic indifference, I must have been pretty far gone. Another few seconds beneath the surface would have finished me off, I suppose, but thanks to some reason I never have been able to explain, I suddenly shot clear. My first lungful of fresh air when I came to the surface instantly swept away my resignation to death, awakened my hopes and desire to live, and set my brain working again. About 20 yards from me, the Hogue's flat, glistening bottom stuck up like a half-tide rock above the surface, with the waves making a clean breach over it. Thus she remained for a few minutes before taking her last plunge. On all sides of me now were hundreds of struggling and drowning men, and realizing the necessity of getting clear of them, I began to swim out into the open. At that moment the dull rumble of gunfire rolled across the sea, and glancing over my shoulder, I saw the Cressy blazing away at what presumably was a conning tower or a periscope. She too had been busily engaged, launching boats to rescue the Aboukir's survivors when we were struck, and spotting the periscope of the submarine attacking us, she'd instantly opened rapid fire and leapt ahead under full power to ram it. Though unsuccessful in this, she would at least have been able to make good her escape had her captain and officers thought of their own safety. But, with greater chivalry than prudence, and what seaman will find it in him to blame them, they returned to continue the work of rescue they had begun. The gunfire I now heard was directed at a periscope which had suddenly bobbed up on the Cressy's starboard quarter. However, almost at the same instant that the first salvo broke loose, the milky white track of a torpedo sped across the surface and the vessel was struck on her starboard side. A second torpedo exploded in her No. 5 boiler room, and before the anguished eyes of the poor fellows who were confidently swimming towards her, she heeled over to starboard and sank. The submarine, it was proved to be only one, had done the hat-trick, bagged the three of us. I shall never forget the dreadful spectacle in the water at that moment. Approximately 2,000 swimming or drowning men were all herded together, hardly with elbow room. Strong swimmers were dragged under in the frenzied clutches of weak swimmers or men who could not swim at all. The cries for help were loud and full-throated at first, but they gradually subsided into a sort of low, wailing chant which rose and fell like the mutter of a surf on a distant shore. The tragic part about it all was the fact that no one had on a lifebelt, for the simple reason that by some stupendous oversight these things had not been served out to the ships. After I had been swimming about aimlessly for a short time, I came across a couple of rolled-up hammocks with which I supported myself with one under each arm. Though a fairly good swimmer, I was badly in need of a rest. I was not allowed to remain in undisputed possession of my find for long, however. In less than no time, half a dozen men were around me. A scramble followed, and becoming waterlogged, the hammocks sank. Striking out on my own once more, I became aware of the fact that my heavy watch was weighing down my right arm and impeding my stroke. The time had come to part with it, and, loosening its chain, I let it sink. 5 or 10 minutes later, I came across our steam packet boat, which has been hoisted outboard when the Hogue sank, and must have unhooked itself and floated clear. Half full of water, the boat lay very low in the sea, so I had little difficulty in dragging myself over its gunwale. There was no one else in it, but while bailing it out, I was joined by half a dozen other men. As soon as we had it sufficiently dry, we set to work to raise steam in the boat. The coal was soaking wet, of course, but by pouring paraffin oil on it and igniting this with the flares that had been hermetically sealed in their cans, we eventually got it to burn. No sooner had we got steam on the boiler and started the engine, however, than a rope, which had been dangling unnoticed over the stern, fouled the propeller and rendered our labours vain. At this stage help arrived. First a Dutch steamer named Flora, bound from Rotterdam to Leith, then our destroyers, and later another Dutch steamer named Titan, and 2 Lowestoft steam trawlers. The Flora rescued 287 men, the Titan and 2 trawlers respectively 25 and 190 men. The remainder of the survivors, numbering around 300, were picked up by our destroyers, which had to break away in the middle of their rescue work to beat off yet another submarine attack. I was one of the survivors picked up by the Flora. One of the last tragic sights I recollect seeing before I walked into the water from the sinking Hogue was our engineer commander, who had been grievously injured in the explosion, being brought on deck. In some inexplicable way, he managed to keep afloat and was picked up, only to die of his injuries, ironically enough. One of my fellow R&R shipmates had been landed sick before the disaster. The other was last seen clinging with other men to a piece of wreckage. Suddenly he said, "I'm done," let go and sank. When little by little the facts of the disaster became known, there was a storm of protest in the English press. Lieutenant Weddigen, the commander of the German submarine which had sunk us, did not live long to enjoy his fame. His submarine was sunk by the dreadnought.
Till to death I go.